Welcome back to the Barley Lads. Today we're talking about Minden Mill Bourbon. I want to talk more so about how this is kind of made, which is a really cool backstory to it, and then kind of get to the whiskey after that. So Minden Mill, they're a single estate producer. They also make a single malt and a rye whiskey on site. They are producing all of the grain on the farm connected to the distillery grounds now. It was formerly it was a mill, so it produced flour and other ground milled grains up until about the 1960s, but then it closed down after that point. It was basically disused for about 50 years, but it was still listed on the National Historic Register places, or whatever they call that. And then about 2012, I think it was the Bentley family, they decided that they wanted to build a distillery there on the site because they already owned it. So they started retrofitting it into a distillery, and it didn't open officially as a distillery until 2019. But like many businesses during COVID, they were just kind of crushed by the lack of people being able to come in, and they couldn't build their brand, and so they closed their doors and sold in 2022. I think they were the Bentley Distillery or something like that, but it was changed to the Minden Mill Distillery. The name changed, nothing else changed, by the Foley family, Foley Family Wines. They own dozens, if not hundreds, I'm not really sure, of wineries around the globe. They also own Loch Lomond in Glen Scotia and Scotland. They also own Two Stacks in Ireland, so this is not their first distillery that they purchased. But what's really cool about what Minden Mill is doing is, because they are in the high desert in Nevada, their typical angel share was 2 to 3%, or the amount that they're losing out of the barrel through evaporation was 2 to 3% per month. Whereas as opposed to like Kentucky or Scotland, places like that, it was usually 2 to 3% a year. So they knew that wasn't something that they could continue doing. So they actually have climate-controlled rick houses. They have two separate ones. They have one just for their single malts, and then they have another one for their bourbon and rye. The single malt one is tied to a weather station in Scotland, so they're keeping the same temperature and humidity that they would find in a Scotland rick house for their single malts, so it can age at a slower pace than they would certainly in Nevada or even in Kentucky. The other warehouse is tied to Bardstown, Kentucky, to a weather station there. So much hotter, much more humid during the summer, much colder during the winter than you would probably find even in Scotland, because we just have harsher winters. So they're aging them in a way that it just produces a really interesting spirit. So this particular one is their bourbon. This is going to be a 4-grain mash bill. It's still predominantly corn. It's 60% corn. It is 20% rye, so still fairly high rye. But what's really interesting about this is 10% barley, which is not untypical, I would say, but also 10% oats. So if you've ever eaten oatmeal, it's a pretty mild grain. It can also be kind of gummy, so it does make it harder to produce, but it gives it a much smoother consistency or mouthfeel to it. I don't know if I'm comfortable saying that. Kind of weird, but so it's a 4-grain, but it's so easy drinking. It is aged 4 years. I don't know if it's affected by being in the barrel in that warehouse differently than it actually would be in Kentucky, but they're still shooting for that. Also, Minden Mill, if you ever watch this, you guys got to work on your glue. Because that came off literally the first time I opened it, I think last week. So get that fixed. But anyway, that's what's in my glass, so let's get to it. This is 94 proof, or 47%. For, only being 4 years, it's pretty light on the nose. Cherry, oak are the predominant smells. Cinnamon. It's definitely tannic. You can kind of feel it drying out your tongue. But the cherry comes through Again, oaky, but you still have some pretty predominant bourbon notes with vanilla is still strong. There is some caramel element to it, but it's almost like a cherry vanilla cola spiciness to it. It's very easy, pleasant to drink. It drinks closer to probably like 86 or proof, 90 proof instead of 94. It feels pretty light, probably because it's fairly young, and it has a pretty short finish. But the cherry vanilla Coke flavor kind of sticks to your tongue, which is super pleasant, very easy to drink. I highly recommend this. I got it here in Ohio for $45, and definitely recommend it. I will say, though, when they changed owners, they brought it in a new master distiller. And I listened to a podcast recently where I believe he was changing the mash bill. So if you want to try this as it stands with the oats in it, you need to buy it now, because I believe they did change the mash bill, but I don't think they've come out with what they've changed it to. So, but again, really cool project with the single estate, the way that they're climate control, and it's just really interesting, coming from an interesting place to be producing whiskey in the high desert in Nevada. So check them out. Cheers.